Welcome back to Magic, Witchcraft, and Religion. I'm David Leitner, I'm your instructor, and this is the second part of our lectures on anthropological theories of religion. So today we're going to be looking more at theories in the mid to late 20th century and the ways that they have impacted the study of anthropology generally, and specifically how they've impacted the study of religion within anthropology. Probably the biggest impact on anthropology in the late 20th century and on the social sciences in general has been a phenomenon called postmodernism. Now, the thing about postmodernism is that it is its own movement, but it's also closely tied to a bunch of other parallel movements that we're going to talk about as well, all of which share similar concerns. Specifically, today we're going to be talking about sort of the way that post-structuralism, Marxist anthropology, feminism, and post-colonialism all kind of come together in the same moment that postmodernism comes about. Now, unfortunately, oftentimes postmodernism is either poorly described or oversimplified when it's being described. Its most notable feature is that it is marked by a reaction to the presumed objectivity and rationality of modernism. Well, what's modernism, you may ask? In this sense, modernism is a period of time marked by an underlying belief in the ability of objectivity and rationalism to control economic, political, social, cultural worlds. This is frequently paired also with a belief in the inevitability of progress. Now, the period of modernism really sort of varies depending on who you ask, but generally speaking, we're looking at a time from around the Renaissance or late medieval period through into the 20th century. But it doesn't really get going and hit its heights until maybe the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution. Now, the postmodernists were being postmodern in the sense that they saw that we had sort of reached the ends of the ability of these of this worldview to actually explain, in particular, social processes, cultural processes. And this was in part based on the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche as well, particularly his observations that truth is not a single objective thing, that in fact actually it is the result of a whole series of metaphors and models that are embedded in social relations that come to seem as if they're real because we have always treated them as such. Or as he said in one of his essays, truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are. So, postmodernism is a reaction to the objectivity of truth claims, and they instead focus on truth as subjective, focus on the construction of truth claims and who has the power to make those claims. Some went so far as to even deny the possibility of any objective truth, while others limit their claims simply to examining how such truth claims intersect with power. It was largely based in considering text and language to be the primary phenomena of human existence. That is, we are human beings embedded in textual and linguistic webs. That this is our main way of conveying culture, of sharing culture, and in manipulating culture. There was a concern with representations and meta-narratives having a bearing on truth claims. And finally, there's a focus on power, and especially the role of power in the production of knowledge. Who gets to produce knowledge? Whose knowledge is legitimated and whose is delegitimated? Parallel movements. I want to start by touching on a movement we touched on briefly last time in the previous lecture, and that is structuralism. Structuralism originates in the sort of late 19th, but really more the early 20th century, with figures like in linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure, and then in sociology and ethnology in France, we have Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss. It draws heavily from a number of veins of thought that were popular at the time in academic circles. In linguistics, we've got Saussure's notion that language is constructed of hidden rules that everybody knows but can't describe. In phenomenology, we have the study of consciousness as something which is always conscious of something. And it is that thing it is conscious of is a whole that is described by the relationship between the subject and object. What that means is you can't separate consciousness from the thing it is conscious of. Finally, in Gestalt psychology, we have the study of human consciousness as something being patterned and where the whole is greater than the parts. Now, although we talked a little bit about Durkheim last time, it's really with Claude Lévi-Strauss where we see the sort of fullest elaboration of the structuralist project here. Lévi-Strauss was in some ways, the father of structural anthropology. Some would say he's also the only one who ever managed to do it successfully. For him, he was focusing on underlying patterns of human thought. He thought that language, and in particular signs and symbols and metaphors, through things like kinship or folklore, could shed light on what the structures of human thought are. Culture, he thought, much like language, is composed of hidden rules, and it's the anthropologist's job to tease them out, to elucidate them. And his method relied on something called binary oppositions, where he would look for opposites, the raw and the cooked, culture versus nature, male versus female, and look at the way they were handled as a way to better understand the pattern underlying these ideas. By the mid-20th century, people are becoming somewhat disenchanted by this notion of structuralism. Many of them are beginning to feel that these models that structuralists and others are building are in fact getting in the way of understanding. They saw the models as too static and too determinative. That is, they left very little room for individual agency or for the process itself to be what was significant. The structuralist believed in a structure that was there and not in the way that structure became. So in response, we've got this post-structuralist movement. Post-structuralists included figures like Pierre Bourdieu, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault. You'll notice a pattern here, right? Structuralism and post-structuralism are both at least originating in France. For Bourdieu, he had a concern with what he called reflexivity, what others have come to call reflexivity, which specifically means how is the observer implicated in the observation and description of culture? How do we position ourselves in our understanding of culture? For Jacques Derrida, the issue for him was to problematize the very grounds that concepts like reason, truth, and knowledge are even based in. In other words, to sort of push reason to its logical extreme. Let's see where it comes from. For Michel Foucault, he focused on the production of truth and knowledge historically. For him, history, much like others saw language, history lies under many layers of suppressed and tacit knowledge that provide the assumptions by which certain knowledge regimes are legitimated and others delegitimated. And therefore, he had a sort of focus on power and power relations. In other words, who has the ability to say, to create knowledge and to say what knowledge is valid and what knowledge isn't. Ironically, although I'm putting Foucault into this category of post-structuralist, he himself resisted being pinned down to any one single label. And that makes, of course, sense because the power to make labels is an expression of this same kind of knowledge production that he was talking about. Next, I want to talk again about interpretivism and symbolic anthropology, a sort of aligned field of thought. You might be a little confused because I talked quite a bit about interpretivism in the last set of lectures, and in particular about Clifford Geertz. But in fact, actually, Geertz, although he was basing a lot of his ideas on Weber, who came much, much earlier, Geertz's expression of those ideas through interpretivism comes much later and is coming in at the same time and in the same context as a lot of these other movements in the mid to late 20th century. So they are tied to post-structuralism in the sense that although they accept structuralist assumptions about symbols constituting a system of meaning, they also reject structuralism's downplaying of individual agency and interpretation of those symbols. There are two main guiding principles in both of these movements, interpretivism and symbolic anthropology. The first is that beliefs must be understood as part of a cultural system of meaning. The second is that actions being guided by the interpretation of symbols allow us to observe and understand conceptual lives by observing the behavior in the context of symbols. In other words, because people's actions are guided by the way they interpret symbols, we can observe their actions in the context of those symbols to try and understand the symbols even better. Of course, this was heavily influenced by the writing of Max Weber, but the two schools differed slightly. For Clifford Geertz and interpretivists, symbols are vehicles for culture. They are the little packets of culture, sort of, that are carrying culture between us. And he focused on how symbols affect how social actors actually experience the world. How do symbols change that interface between you and the world? Interesting to note, Geertz was actually quite ambivalent about postmodernism in anthropology, and he saw it as two movements, one that was more this literary movement of looking at ethnography as a genre of writing, and the other as a political movement, taking particular political stances on representation of the subaltern or of people not traditionally represented and who has the right to represent. Victor Turner, who was more aligned with the symbolic anthropology side of things, for him, symbols are not vehicles of culture, but they are operators in the social process. And by different arrangements of these operators, individuals will align to societal norms differently, and it plays a role in aligning to societal norms, resolving conflicts, and plays a huge role in Turner's idea of how individuals are transformed socially, particularly through things like rites of passage. Now, Marxist anthropology is such a varied field, I can only do the briefest treatment of it here. There are at least 4 different strands of Marxism in anthropology. We've got Marvin Harris's cultural materialism, Julian Stewart's cultural ecology, Leslie White's Cultural Evolution, and finally the sort of French Marxist anthropology that was practiced by Maurice Bloch, Eric Wolf, Maurice Godelier, and was closely tied to other Marxist movements in France in the mid-20th century as well. What they all share in common, regardless of what makes them different, is that for them, culture is a function of the material conditions of a society. They saw society as consisting in three parts: a base or infrastructure, which was the modes of production. How are things made, and how are people arranged in such a way to make them? The superstructure, which are the laws, the government, and other sort of legal or political mechanisms at work that shape that that further shape that mode of production and cemented. And finally, ideology, that includes religion, philosophy, and other ideals of society, which keep it all tied together. They also all had an interest in power as well, through the sort of Marxist notion of mystification, which is the process by which a ruling class creates false consciousness that serves the ruling class, through the use of superstructure, as we just described, and also through, in many cases, Antonio Gramsci's notion of cultural hegemony. This is the different ways that a hegemonic class can exert political leadership and control over a subaltern or a subordinated class by convincing them to participate in their own subjugation and their own exploitation. The next big movement we need to talk about is feminism and feminist anthropology. Now, as with feminism in general, there have been at least three waves of feminist theory in anthropology. In the first wave, where we can look sort of from the late 19th into the early 20th century, maybe even up to the mid 20th century, we can see an emphasis on including women's experiences in ethnographic data. There was a recognition that even though anthropology, even in the early 20th century, had more women practicing as anthropologists in it than most other fields did, nonetheless, most ethnographies were still accounts of men's experiences and data collected from men by men. In the second wave, which starts in the early 20th century and leads through the 1970s and 80s, we see a concerted effort to draw distinctions between sex and gender, particularly in challenging the supposed universality of gender roles. In the third wave, finally, this would be sort of the 1980s and beyond, we've got focuses on differences between women and the intersections of sex, gender, sexuality, and power, with an increased emphasis on intersectionality. By differences between women here, what I mean is not necessarily what makes women different, but rather how does feminist theory need to account for other differences between women, how women in different positions, social classes, race, culture might experience sexism and other forms of subordination in different ways. Whereas the first and second waves were heavily influenced by Marxist analyses of material production and the constructions, in particular, of the public and domestic spheres, the third wave also becomes much more influenced by these postmodern movements, and particularly by various identity movements in the mid to late 20th century, including, it's not right to call post-colonialism an identity movement, but it's sort of happening alongside these. But civil rights movements, the rise of culture studies, LGBTQ and queer theory, intersectionality, performativity theory. All of these are sort of coming up and bubbling up and influencing this third wave at the same time. Here are just a few notable feminist anthropologists. Margaret Mead, who wrote Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies in 1935, argued that acceptable gender roles were arbitrary and determined by culture. She was an influential figure in mid-20th American mainstream society, particularly her writing on parenting, but also in the counterculture for her ideas about free love. Sherry Ortner in 1974 published Is Female to Male as Nature is to Culture, in which she argued that because women have traditionally been associated with nature, and nature is typically subordinated to culture, to science, and so forth, and men are usually associated with those things, that there is an equation there, and that in fact actually it is this association with nature which provides part of the conceptual justification for the subordination of women to men in many Western societies. Lila Abu-Lughod wrote Writing Women's Worlds, Bedouin Stories in 1993, and shows how Bedouin women find advantages in highly gender-segregated societies. This was especially important because it was not only challenging the treatment of women in supposedly third world countries by anthropological theory and Euro-American feminists, but it was also pointing to ways that the experience of gender was much more complex even within these types of societies where gender is highly segregated. Finally, we come to post-colonialism. Now, with the dissolution of the European colonial system throughout the 20th century, this caused new social, cultural, economic, and political shifts, which many of the previous approaches in anthropology and other fields of social science were not well equipped to understand. Having a Eurocentric lens prevented a lot of people from understanding what was really going on in the post-colonial context. This school of thought is often traced back to the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978. And in it, he critiques the way that Euro-Americans have described non-Euro-American others, and that their ability to do so is always based on making studies of the other and then producing knowledge and convictions that are in turn used as a form of power against or over those same people. In other words, it's almost a self-justifying process. The focus of post-colonial theory was not only to examine the harmful effects of colonialism, but to interrogate how the processes that enabled those harms in the first place continued after colonialism. In other words, the end of colonies was not necessarily the end of Western colonial power. One key answer to this was a call for the subjects of description to be given the chance to represent themselves as well. This brings us to the writing culture moment, what's sometimes called the postmodern turn in anthropology, or the writing culture term. In the 1980s, all of these previous problems and ideas had been bubbling up for a few decades. And a number of ethnographers, a number of anthropologists had come together to start talking about what this means for anthropology. In 1986, this resulted in the publication of a book based on a series of seminars at the School of American Research called Writing Culture. Now, this was an edited volume with multiple authors contributing, so they covered a lot of area, but the book boils down to a few key themes. One is the subjectivity of ethnography and ethnographers, that is, challenging the so-called objectivity of anthropology as a science. This in turn had them asking questions about what kind of authority anthropology has or should have. And also it treated ethnography as a genre of writing, recognizing that we are not producing just some faceless knowledge here, but that there is a product to the research, and that product is written, and therefore has the aspects of genre that other forms of writing have. And therefore, many of the authors employed literary critique as a way to interrogate ethnography and encourage experimentation in writing styles to get beyond the ethnographic form, the ethnographic genre, to see what productive forms of knowledge we could make from that. Obviously, postmodern concerns with authority, power, knowledge, and representation are key here. And so this is really sort of the moment that postmodernism enters anthropology full force. Now, obviously, writing culture was not without its critics, and it produced a number of quite vociferous criticisms and debates that continued throughout the 1990s even. But by and large today, although most anthropologists would probably not label themselves as postmodernists, it's probably not to do as much with being against postmodernism as it is, much like Michel Foucault, a refusal to settle for easy labels. But this postmodernism taking, and by that I mean both postmodernism proper and all of these other movements that I've been talking about, it has certainly influenced anthropology through to today. We can see that in increased emphases on power, representation, subjectivity, and the position of the ethnographer or the anthropologist vis-a-vis the people that we describe. More concerns with studying up, that is, turning the anthropologist's eye back on the societies that the anthropologists come from and on the structures of power that enable anthropology to be anthropology. It also has led to calls for more participatory and collaborative methods, that is, not viewing the people we work with in the field as simply subjects or even informants, but actually looking at them as active participants in our study, helping us co-create the meaning that will eventually become the endpoint of the research, but giving them a role in that. Oftentimes going so far as to even get rid of the anthropologist altogether and try experiments in giving people the tools to do this for themselves. It also has resulted in, to a lesser extent, some experiments in the form of ethnography. In particular, autobiographical forms like autoethnography have become increasingly accepted, although certainly not the mainstream of anthropology, and experiments even in literary fiction, using fiction as a way to tell the same kinds of stories that ethnography allows us to tell as well. Finally, there's been a reevaluation of what anthropology is and does, and why it should be or shouldn't be done. Last but not least, let's think about the impacts on the anthropology of religion. Obviously, anything that talks about the construction of truth and reality dovetails neatly with the study of religion, because we understand religion as one of the key components in the ways people construct their worldview. In fact, actually, one of the things that this postmodern turn has allowed us to do is to actually start turning these ideas like religion around onto phenomena like, say, scientism. That is, points in time when people treat science in a way as religion itself. Religion has been a site of power historically and in the present, and that's both by the practitioners of that religion, and in the colonial context, religion very much became a tool of colonization and a tool of control. We now have an emphasis on this in the study of religion too. Understanding women's roles and the effects of religion on women's lives has become an increasingly common theme. And understanding religion as a shaper of political, economic, and cultural systems is becoming more common. Finally, anthropologists are less likely to try and create authoritative accounts of particular religions, as in Hinduism is X, right? And look instead at the processes that create religion, or the processes that religion enables, even. In other words, what is it we're actually seeing, rather than creating sort of piles of facts about a particular object we call religion. I hope that's been a little more helpful. You will see more and more of this as we move throughout the semester and see more examples of ethnographies or short films that are ethnographic in nature about the ways that anthropologists represent religion today and how we talk about it. So that's all for now. Until next time, take care of yourself, and I'll see you soon.